Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Eli Scheinman. I'm a senior advisor at Art Basel, focused on our digital art initiatives. Welcome to Digital Dialogues. Very excited. This is the 5th instantiation of Digital Dialogues, and I think that bears mentioning because each time this group convenes and comes together for these conversations, there are really material changes at the intersection of art and technology. So over the course of several months, between fairs, there may be substantive evolutions and innovations that really bear conversation and interrogation and these conversations that we'll have today. In particular, today we'll focus on conversations around artificial intelligence. There are questions of authorship and the collecting experience and the creative process. And I think we have many of the sharpest minds in terms of artist and collector and curator and writer to help us interrogate and break down and unpack those conversations, those dimensions of our lives that are now affecting basically the social fabric of everyday life and the art world more specifically. The last thing I'll mention is that I think by showing up, meaning all of you, and participating in these conversations, you all are really demonstrating thought leadership by seeing around corners and investigating with us conversations that might be somewhat non-obvious to the broader art world today. But over time, my belief, my view, is that these will be fundamental, obviously, perhaps, to our daily lives, but also specifically to the art world. So I'll pass it off to Steph from TAIEX, who is presenting today's Digital Dialogues with us. Steph?
Thank you, Eli.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here today for the Digital Dialogues. My name is Stephanie de Regel. I'm the director of TAIEX. Thanks to the vision of our wonderful founder, Ina Bajenova, we are co-hosting now already for a year the Digital Dialogues. Exactly 1 year ago, we started here, and we've been in Hong Kong, in Miami, and it's truly exciting to be able to drive the digital conversation forwards, to have all these wonderful curators, artists, institutions gather here and discuss this very interesting world of digital art. So TAIEX is a digital art platform. We co-produce, showcase digital art, and we have a very important educational wing, which is why we are very supportive of this initiative. And in September, we will be launching a TAIEX review, which will focus on bringing news exclusively on digital art. So keep an eye open for that, which will really bring a concrete form to this educational wing that we've been working on for the last 2 years. So I hope you enjoy the conversations. Thank you very much for being here. And I would like to call on stage Jenny Fulton, who's the curator of the Digital Dialogues.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And also from my side, a very warm welcome to the 5th edition of Art Basel's Digital Dialogues. We are delighted to be back here to be presenting some of the most cutting-edge conversations around the relationship between art and technology. And I'm thrilled to introduce the first panel to you, which is entitled Seeing Like a Machine, The Hidden Costs of Artificial Intelligence. Artificial intelligence is everywhere, from the way we search online to how cities, bodies, and even ecosystems are being monitored and shaped. But what these systems really see and what they miss. In this conversation, renowned AI scholar, artist, and professor Kate Crawford will offer a perspective on machine learning, revealing the vast networks of data, labor, and environmental resources that power these technologies. She will be partnered by Alistair Hudson, the CEO of Karlsruhe's ZKM Center for Art and Media. And this session will invite you to rethink urgently what intelligence really means in a time of planetary urgency. So please help me welcoming on stage Kate Crawford and Alistair Hudson. Over to you.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for giving us a full house. It's very nice to be here at the fair and discussing AI with Kate Crawford. a leading scholar on the subject of AI and a critical voice in many respects on AI, a leading scholar at USC. And also I can quote other elements of her bio from my notes in here as well. So really, you came to prominence, I guess, with the book Atlas of AI, which really starts to dig down into the history of this phenomenon that's now dominating our lives. But you also operate in a way in an artistic sense as well, using artistic platforms and particularly producing large-scale works, I would say, which are initially the anatomy of an AI, and then you went later into this latest work, which is the Calculating Empires project with Vladan Jola. And this project recently won the Silver Lion at the Venice Architecture Biennial this year, so congratulations. But I think it's probably just worth going into that a little bit more as a start for people who maybe don't know the work, really around what the methodology is of calculating empires and what was the push to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Alistair, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here. So calculating empires is a really enormous project. It took us 5 years because we decided to do something pretty impossible, which is to map the relationship between power and technology over 5 centuries. And obviously, in doing a project like that, it raises a set of key questions, which is, what has happened over the last 5 centuries where you can see echoes, repetitions, and patterns? And how do you share that with people? And of course, we settled on the form of the diagram. And I've always found diagrams really interesting. They, of course, have this centuries-long tradition, starting as a sort of a medieval religious object. You would have extraordinary cosmological diagrams that mapped out the relationship of the heavens to the earth. Or we could fast forward to mathematicians like Charles Sanders Peirce, of course, who did wonderful diagrams of human thought. So diagrams are this very powerful way to, almost in a non-linear fashion, connect different stories together. So we began this project and we started this deep research into the histories of technology and power, and then drawing thousands and thousands and thousands of images. And before we knew it, we'd sort of created this 24-meter monster. But what our hope is, in a form like that, is that you can explore it, you can find your own stories, and you can map different pathways that hopefully access different futures.
Yeah, and also in the terms of the context of an art fair like this, where often we're dealing with a singular image or even a singular moving image, these are fields of images. This is a very different way of producing art and thinking about what art is and what it can do. I think it's interesting as well that I noted that one of the works here in Untitled is a textile map of trade before 1500, and it immediately made me think. So why is this time frame important? Maybe talk a little bit more about this age of empire being defined in this way.
I love this question because 1500 was obviously a very conscious choice, and we chose it for 3 reasons. 1500, depending which economist you believe, is where we start to see the emergence of global capitalism. We also see the emergence of long-range shipping. So the sort of great empires like the Venetian Empire start constructing boats that can travel much further, which of course enables the birth of European colonialism. And then of course we start to see the emergence of global information sharing in the form of the Gutenberg press. So towards the end of the 1400s, you start to see this construction of knowledge as something that travels, that can be shared, that can be archived. And so in that relationship between capital, information, and colonization is really the story of calculating empires. So by looking at that emergence, we can see what's happening right now, particularly with artificial intelligence, as a concentration of those patterns, of enclosing and capturing information, of dominating particular forms, industries, and capacities, but also, I think, fundamentally changing our relationship to how we see others and how we see ourselves.
Yeah, and I always think that image of global trade routes in our pre-moment is also it also prefigures the iconic image, which is the routes of the undersea cables that provide the internet. But now for me it seems like we've gone beyond that. Even the internet seems slightly out of date in the same way that these empire trade routes do, when you have this phenomenon of kind of multi-directional AI operating now. Is that something that changes our picture? Is there a new picture that emerges?
I think that's exactly right. Obviously, having this conversation here in 2025, we're all experiencing an inflection point. We are seeing the construction of an industrial revolution that I think is just as profound as any we've experienced as a species. We're seeing the construction of infrastructures that are planetary in scale and extraordinarily concentrated in terms of who runs them and who has access to decide how these models work. But it's fractured, and it's, as you say, sort of a multiplicity. It doesn't follow the sort of traditional lines, but it does build on them. So you can look at those submarine cables. They're still core infrastructure. But now we have satellites in the sky. We have hyperscale data centers in the desert. We have these new forms of infrastructural control and domination. But they always build on the earlier architectures. So for us, it's about telling these multiplicities of stories, which is why I love, I guess, complexity, allowing for complexity.
Yeah.
Not going to the TikTok 10-second explainer, but saying, here is a work that might take you a couple of days to really explore and read. And that's a radical act now. This is a radical act of slow reading and allowing for multiplicity.
And I should point out, you can explore these incredible maps online, right, as well, where you can really zoom in to the stories and look at certain subjects, look at certain trajectories. So it's worth exploring beyond the immediate image. And also this subject of critical cartography, I like this term very much, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the way you go about your research and the relationship between research and art, which is not normally the domain of research. So perhaps, can I ask why you have kind of fed into the world of art? And also, I'm interested in the making, because as an artist, your sort of the artistic aspect of your work is about making, but making through research, and maybe to give a picture of how you do that, how you accomplish this gathering of information that I imagine just takes years and incredible mental dexterity to find these things out.
I mean, it's funny, actually. We spent a lot of time working on this map in a monastery in Montenegro, and I felt like there was something about that monastic life, surrounded by books, calling up key professors and historians of technology to sort of test
the new illuminated manuscript.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like illuminating a manuscript over 5 years. It really dominated our lives in a particular way. But I think this moment of how do we share research and information with each other? How do we tell complex stories? This is one of the biggest challenges we face. And obviously, you can do something in a book, but a book is always linear. You're telling a linear story. You can always write academic papers, but that's speaking to a very small audience of specialists. What I think we need now, when it comes to what's happening with AI and the concentration of power in our societies, is we need spaces for public discussion. So part of what we do in this kind of critical cartography, which is mapping but critically analyzing the way that AI is working, from its environmental impacts, its labor impacts, and obviously its data capture, is to create a space that you can walk into, that you can have a conversation with friends. I mean, one of my favorite things is seeing how this work is being received in places like Venice and the Jeu de Paume is you will see strangers get together and say, how is this happening right now? What is going on that we have essentially 8 billionaires determining the life worlds of 8 billion people? And that becomes a public conversation in a certain way. So I think it's about, interestingly, a type of democratization of research that you can do in a way that goes beyond traditional academic parameters.
Yeah, and for me, one of the big problems we have at the moment is people talk about AI like it's a single entity, a thing. I always laughed at that the Mission Impossible film where the AI is in a kind of metal tennis ball, and they're all trying to get to it. We need to get the AI, and of course it's not that at all. But we're being sold it this way, and there's this political arms race. I get all the politicians in Germany saying, "What are you doing about AI?" And it's like, well, what kind of AI? In what sense are you talking about AI? But it's just this idea that that's where we need to be. And I'm guessing what you're trying to do is unravel that and say there's a lot more to this that we all need to understand collectively.
There is a lot more that we need to understand, and I think part of what's happening is that we're being sold a vision. We're being told that AI is this immaterial, abstract, green technology that just operates in the cloud, which of course is a very dematerialized metaphor in itself. But instead, it really is the most materially intensive system that we have ever built as humans. Right now, we know that generative AI is using as much electricity as the nation of Japan. Current estimates are that generative AI, to be specific around the type, will use as much energy as India by 2030. I mean, this is extraordinary. And then, of course, there's the issues of water. We know that AI in this new hyperscale form is extraordinarily thirsty. It's drawing on just vast gigaliters of water. For example, if you're using ChatGPT for, let's say, 20 questions and answers, that is the equivalent of taking a half-liter bottle of water and just pouring it on the ground. Because that is how much water is required to heat these enormously, basically heat-producing GPUs. So when we start to look at that physical infrastructure, you see a different story of artificial intelligence. When you start to look at the types of labor that are actually being used to build these systems and that are being evaporated by these systems, you see a different story. And then when you start to look at what is happening with our own culture, our own information, our own artistic history, which of course is being captured and then resold to us, you see a different history. So how do we put all of these together? Well, it requires a really large map. It requires a way that can actually weave those stories together, almost like a tapestry. We often think about the form of the tapestry was, again, traditionally a way to tell long and complex stories, political stories. AI is also a political story. So I think informing each other, but also making this an issue for our political systems is one of the most important things we can do.
Yeah, and is this expansion of AI, is this a continuation of empire or another form of it?
I think it's both. It's clearly a continuation of empire. If we look at the ways in which empires have traditionally related to indigenous knowledge and indigenous populations, the way that empires have related to land, the way that empires have related to their own need to constantly grow and harvest power, we can see that taking place today. We can see it with Elon Musk sitting to the right hand of the American president. That level of power is absolutely one of empire. But it's also different in the fact that this is a truly global empire that is affecting all of us. And in many cases, even if you don't use AI, you might be sitting in this room and saying, I don't use artificial intelligence. But of course now, every time you open a browser, you're being given an AI-generated answer.
I'm using it now.
Exactly, you're using it right now. So it's becoming, for us, like the air that we breathe. And that comes with very real implications for our own intellectual autonomy, for our own sort of political systems, and I think for democracy as well.
And also, in a way, the AI heat bubble that we're in now, for example, this real gold rush is really only a few years old. And before this, there were huge debates around moving towards a circular economy, reducing endless growth, finding other economic, political models which would protect the planet. And now, what we're seeing now is really everybody forgetting that, and Muskism promoting this intergalactic expansionism, so that empire now goes beyond our planet. Is this very much part of the map?
Yes, and at the top of the map, you'll see this story told, which is, I think, this absolute, as you say, sort of profound erasure of the dangers of growth at that level, and this fantasy of, well, we can all live on Mars, and really ignoring the one planet that can sustain human life in a way that we would actually aspire to. So there's something at the moment that I think we really need to understand is what goes along with that story. And I'll give you an example. So right now, Elon Musk has built what he claims is the world's largest data center. He calls it, wait for it, Colossus, of course, very modest name. And Colossus is built in South Memphis, which is a historically black community. And because this enormous data center needed more energy that the grid could provide, he has rolled out a series of methane gas generators, which are issuing nitrogen oxides and formaldehyde into the air. And so now they're seeing increased rates of asthma in children. You're seeing extraordinary health costs on that community. And that community is completely blindsided. They weren't asked if they wanted this infrastructure in their neighborhoods. And now they're trying to sue, they're trying to fight back. But it's very difficult if you're suing the richest man on the planet, who happens to be in many times, depending when they're getting on, closely connected to the US president. So that's the kind of power differential that we're looking at. And I think by the way that artificial intelligence is now being operated, which really is as the information infrastructure for everybody, but run by a handful of companies, that addressing that power disparity is actually the biggest challenge that we're going to face.
Yeah, and I was looking recently at the history of cybernetics. We have at ZKM, we're developing a research strand around this, and particularly the kind of iconic project, which was CyberSyn in Chile in the 1970s, where basically the socialist government, Allende, conceived of a plan to work with Stafford Beer, cybernetician from the UK, and a kind of, an advisor in the field of business management, but to devise a computational system to run the country from the ground up. So this was computer-powered socialism and actual genuine participatory democracy, rather in real time, with people in real time contributing, but was basically seen as a threat to the predominant capitalist world order. And the CIA, it's an amazing, fascinating story. They basically shut it down. Allende was overthrown in a coup. He died. And this knowledge, or this way of harnessing computational power for citizens, for participants, was erased from our imaginary. And my thinking now is it possible that we could think of another operating system for our planet, or possibly our universe in 100 years' time, that really could redirect these energies, these thought processes, these systems to work in a more generally democratic way? Is that possible, or is that just completely destined to go wrong?
Well, what I love about CyberSyn is it just reminds us that things can be otherwise. I mean, it was an extraordinary project that a cybernetician, a British cybernetician, could go to Chile and say, let's build a computational system that will allow the people to vote on key governmental decisions and are actually included in many more stages of decision-making than just voting once every 4 years. So it was a really radical project, and I recommend, if you'd love to know more about it, there is a book by Eden Medina called Cybernetic Revolutionaries that tells this story in such a vivid way. And she also created an art exhibition talking about the relationship between research and art, where you can go inside the computer rooms that were built for CyberSyn, where you could see the voting buttons and you could see how populations were responding to key policies. Now, obviously, we lost all of that with the violent overthrow by Pinochet, but it reminds us that these histories are there. And in doing this map project, in doing Calculating Empires, we kept just finding these stories, like alternative histories of computation that could have happened, but that got shut down at key moments. And they're all still waiting for us. They're this treasure trove in history that we can gain inspiration and insight from. Creative insight, technological insight, different ways of having political organization as well. So I think for us, that was one of the sort of the gems of this project, was going into these histories of computation done by water, thinking about whether you could run computers with slime molds or with amino acids. These are now continuing stories that run in parallel to this vision of corporate dominant AI that we're being sold every day. So they are out there. Our challenge, I think, is to say, what's possible at a community level? What's possible that can be done on a smaller scale? What if everything doesn't have to be massive, planetary, and extractive by nature? I think that is actually a really exciting question for all of us to think about.
And does it have to be AI-based? Could there be, I mean, you know, we talk about fields of dirty computing or messy computing. You mentioned water-based computers. There was even someone actually at Venice who I met in Harvard last week who basically turned the waves of the Venice canals into a computational system. There are these ways of playing with computing that I think, do you think we've lost it? Is this something we need to somehow get back?
Well, this is the narrowing of the imagination that we've seen with corporate AI. And what you know, of course, from your work in the sort of deep computational history, and something that we have had such delight in exploring, is going back into other forms of computation. AI is, in many ways, like taking a battleship to a knife fight. It is so overscaled, over-optimized. In many cases, you can actually use much simpler forms of computation and earlier forms of machine learning to do many of the things that we need. But the marketing is, oh, if you're going to be cutting edge, you have to be using AI. It's simply not true. But also for the artists in the room, I think there are these other ways of building computational knowing and extra computational knowing. Like, how do we start to think about the forms of human knowing and knowledge that actually don't have to be computational at all? So part of that is telling different narratives, looking at different systems, and I think challenging this very, very strong marketing rhetoric that we're being told there's only one way forward, that there's a type of technological inevitability. And so much of my work has been about challenging that inevitability and saying, we have multiple paths forward, but we need to make that a collective conversation. It's not just an individual one. It's not just saying, well, I'll use less GPT. It's like, well, how do we actually ask these companies to make these systems such that they're not actually so damaging to the environment, so, and in many ways, abrogating of intellectual property? There are alternatives out there.
And so I think this, in a way, leads on to, in a way, the art question, I suppose, which is, you know, we're in an art fair, we're at the kind of Art Basel, the epicenter of the international art world. What is it that art can do, and what is it that the institutions of art can do? What is the potential there?
I think there's a really important moment right now for art institutions to grapple with what's happening. What is occurring is happening so quickly, and the shift in power is, in many cases, happening out of sight, and many people are unaware of what this shift to AI is going to mean for their jobs, for their families, for the institutions they care about. One of the things that I've found really powerful about art institutions is the ability to show things in different ways. So rather than seeing like a machine, you can see in different kinds of radical collectives. Now, of course, museums can also be part of these systems of extraction as well. In fact, on the map of Calculating Empires, we look at the histories of theft of cultural objects around the world. That is definitely something that institutions have to confront, you know, their own colonial histories. But they're doing that, and in doing that, you can have these conversations differently. So I'm also seeing that a lot of the research around that's challenging AI, that's critical, is getting co-opted. It's being co-opted by policy, it's being co-opted by corporations. But in art spaces are still these moments of gathering of, in many cases, strangers, where we can have these conversations and start to say, how else would we like this to be? Rather than assuming that technology is at the center and we just have to tame it in some way or learn to master it, what if we decentered technology and said, what kind of world do we want to live in? And how does technology serve that vision rather than drive it?
Yeah, and is there some, I mean, for me, in all these discussions, for me, it always comes back to education. And it's, in a way, it's the same with art, that we teach art badly, we teach history badly, we teach science badly. And my view is, we should, in a way, we should use art and artistic processes to teach. what do you think we could do in our education system? And I mean, really, going back to 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds, this really is where we need to start. How would we begin to create a mindset in the next generations that could really be equipped to deal with the challenges that AI is presenting us with? I mean, I already have conversations with physicists, for example, from CERN, who say, we're not getting the students we need because they're taught in isolation, that they don't know collaborative learning, and they don't know art. And you need to be able to visualize, to understand diagrams. You need to be able to be an artist in order to be a really good physicist. So after doing all this research, is there something we could do? What could we campaign for if we were to be able to change the system?
I love this question, Alistair, because we are in an educational crisis at the moment. I'm sure many of you read the New York Magazine story that showed that 70% of college students are just using large language models to answer every single paper. And really just not seeing universities as a place of education, but as a place of performing that you know how to use AI. Right now, even in our K through 12, you're seeing classes that really say you're either a user or a producer of AI, and that's all you're here to do. You use the front end, or maybe you study computer science to make a system. There's something in the middle that we're missing. So this would be my campaign for forensic literacy around AI, and not just AI, but the systems around it. The systems of the economic systems, the environmental systems, the deep histories of how we got here. That forensic literature and that sort of forensic way of seeing, I think, is something that we urgently need in education. And I think it isn't, by its nature, if I can suggest this, it's interdisciplinary. It gets us out of these silos where you're just studying a single discipline, but saying we have to think transversely. We have to take these cuts through forms of thinking, seeing, understanding, and representing information. This, of course, is a pretty radical change from the way that we currently teach students. But let's be honest, the traditional model that we've lived with for 500 years of education is collapsing in front of our eyes. The idea that you could give someone an essay question and they'll come back having read a lot of books and written something, that's gone. So we have to think about alternative radical forms of pedagogy. In some ways, it could be also going back to the Socratic method, where we're actually having conversations and having those discussions and calling on people and saying, what do you know? What would you like to know? And learning from each other. Because when you're going through an enormous social transformation like this one, hierarchies are already going to be upended. We have to learn about this stuff together with our students and say, how do we ask those forensic questions, and then how do we share them?
Yeah, and do you think we need to, is it necessary to understand how these things work because in order to create those different societal models, those educational models? Because, you know, in that history of computing, it was often about how do you replicate the brain, and then you make a machine that replicates the brain, and then that brain then replicates again in producing a societal organization. And we always use our technology to describe the world around us. Like 19th century, we'd use steam engines as a metaphor, the engine as a metaphor. And now it's hard because AI doesn't really have the metaphors. It could do, but we can't see under the bonnet.
Yes, and actually the metaphors we have are broken. I mean, let's be clear. Comparing AI to the brain is an absolute Cartesian dualistic trap. These are not brains, and they're not human intelligence in any way that we would recognize it. As humans, our intelligence is developed socially, in relation with each other, with our environment, with our communities, with our cities. We don't sit in tanks just absorbing knowledge and then spitting it out. So I think even the metaphor of artificial intelligence is fundamentally the wrong one, because as we know, these systems are neither artificial nor intelligent. They're actually large-scale statistical recognition and generation machines. Now, that can be very powerful in some contexts, but there's a lot of things they can't do. And I think the minute we fall into this trap of thinking that we are creating an intelligence, a mind that is greater than our own, we accede our own agency. We give over our own power. and we outsource our own cognition. And that is the thing that worries me the most. I'm sure you saw the study that came out 3 days ago from MIT that looked at the impacts of students who had been using ChatGPT for a year, and then basically gave them a test at the beginning and a test at the end. And this study showed there was actually a decline in their analytical abilities, their abilities to write, to reflect, to summarize. And that's in a year. So we're in the middle of the biggest social experiment without controls at the moment. And I think that is where we have to start changing our metaphors and look at AI as an enormous corporate system of knowledge capture and prediction that will have far-reaching social consequences.
Yeah, and I suppose there's ways in which we probably need to develop like counter narratives as well, and I think that's why this kind of history of messy computing comes in, and the fact that in the history of computational design, computational development, often they did work with artists. You know, I think about we're restoring this piece by Gordon Pask at the moment at ZKM, and Gordon Pask was the cybernetician, but he did his research through basically making artworks. He did it by making these elaborate constructions with signals and mirrors and reflectors and light signals, which in this case was designed to demonstrate conversation theory and how meaning is developed through conversation, not just the raw data itself. So could you see a way in which we could, you know, kind of really encourage or harness this playfulness within the way we deal with this, what we see as hard technology?
Well, it's funny because all of our hard technologies have come out of labs that included artists. I mean, of course, Bell Labs, one of the most significant industrial labs in computational history, employed artists to actually develop some of the core systems. I'm thinking here of Lillian Schwartz, who is, I think, one of the most important artists who has worked with computational media, who sadly passed away last year. But her work has been an enormous influence on me and so many others. She changed ideas around the display, around how we would actually create video in terms of the computational space. And we forget these histories. The same is true of artificial intelligence. So if we go back to, the Dartmouth Conference, 1956, this was an interdisciplinary room of people from different fields. It wasn't all engineers. It wasn't all mathematicians. Of course, computer science didn't even exist at that time. But they were including in these organizations conferences where you would invite artists and anthropologists and sociologists, where Margaret Mead would sit next to Stafford Beer. And we need that again, because AI is fundamentally an interdiscipline, and it's a way of seeing. And who thinks about interdisciplinary ways of seeing but artists? So I think in many ways this is not just to use artists as like the underlings to make something like a Google video model kind of cooler. That is not what I think artists should be doing. Of course, we've seen that happen. But in the core of designing how these things work and should not work, that's where I think artists are really powerful. So you've seen a kind of corporatization of artists as being in these sort of programs which are used as marketing, not used in core conceptualization. So imagine what that could do. I mean, that to me is potentially the much more interesting tech company that will be born sometime in the next few years that says, this is not about creating algorithms in a narrow sense. This is about thinking about how we want to live together, and artists need to be part of that conversation.
And my passion is thinking about how we apply this in social context. And my big worry is that a lot of AI-related artworks at the moment, and if I'm being really critical, are creating a kind of spectacularism and a distraction to what the true potential could be. And I don't know whether you have views on these kind of mass entertainment models.
Right. I mean, I think we've all seen at the moment that there's this form of AI art that is literally just using the tools to say, hey, cool picture,
look
bro.
What we can do.
Look what we can do. And there's no critical substrate. There's no asking questions. There's not even pushing the boundaries. I mean, that does happen. I want to be clear. In fact, some of those artists are in this room. I'm looking at you, Sasha Stiles, and many others who are doing work using these tools to show their limits, to show the grain, to show the weft and the weave. but it's rare because what we are seeing instead is a speculative celebration that is hiding these stories about the environmental impacts, the labor impacts, the social impacts. That's the story that artists have always told for centuries. So we're going to get there, but I think it's going to take us time because as with any new form of media, there's a, oh, wow, cool factor.
Yeah.
But then we start to say, at what cost? And who is paying? And how is this going to change the way that we live?
Yeah, what's it for in the end? Yeah. But there are great examples of artists working this way, but I kind of feel like the climate is very hard to make critical art at the moment. We haven't even touched upon our current global context at the moment, but I can think of artists like Winnie Soon, who generated basically a model where she could basically track and trace the censorship of the Chinese government on their social media platforms as well. And literally, in live time, she developed basically a machine learning model that could show where words and phrases were disappearing in real time. But I mean, you've done a lot, probably more research than anybody else in this field. Is the current political climate with Trumpism and Putin and China and the rest, is this making it harder?
I'll be honest, this is one of the most risky and I think dangerous periods for expression for people living in the United States in particular, which is where I'm based. And I have to say the chilling of speech in just the last 3 months has been terrifying to see. And not because just people are lacking courage, because so much is on the line. It might mean that they lose their visa. It might mean that they lose their home. It might mean that they're subject to forms of public harassment. I mean, what's been happening at the moment has been a gutting of every funding institution that feeds both art and research. We can look at the NEA. We can look at the NSF. We can look at the NIH. These are the institutions that were part of the Vannevar-Bush Accord that was made in the post-war era, that the United States would rise on the basis of research and innovation working hand in hand, of creating industries that would then go on to lead the world. And that accord has been fundamentally broken. We're starting to see researchers leave in droves. We're seeing labs close. We're seeing important forms of health research be shut down. And artists are just one of many groups who are now, I think, facing a world where funding is scarce or non-existent, where speaking openly is actually going to threaten your livelihood or that of your family, and your ability to show work is changing. So I have to say, I've actually been shocked. I lived through Trump 1. This is a very different scenario. So all of the things that people like myself and others have worked on, be it regulating AI, be it raising up issues around climate change, these fields are now seen as absolutely unmentionable, or in some cases, organizations are being criminalized. So it could not be more serious, which means that conversations like this, again, Europe is going to have to face the fact that this is going to require an enormous shift to really saying we're going to lead the world. Because right now, the United States has stepped away from that form, not just of soft power, but of funding the kind of art, research, and health that has actually benefited so many of us in this room. So I think having this conversation seriously it's really overdue. The question is, how are artists going to react? And again, if we look historically, artists have always responded to forms of authoritarianism with extraordinary power, and I think by forming art movements that could find ways of representing the stakes of what's going on. And my hope is that is what we're going to do together.
And in terms of, yes, please do. In terms of regulation, there was recently a push to put in place regulations, but is that feasible, given the will to power of so many people in this field?
Well, let's look what happened in Trump's first week in power in this administration. He rolled back the only AI controls, they weren't even regulations, that we had, and he also pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So we've seen what's happened there, which is basically a giant vacuum where basically we had a regulatory vision. And Europe, of course, now has the AI Act. Now, it's not perfect, but you have a system that is going to give you a way to say, not everything can be taken, not everything can actually be done here. We're going to have limits whereby we demand forms of transparency and accountability. And I hope environmental sustainability, we're not there yet, but that's the regulation that we need. So basically, this is going to have to be done in other parts of the world that aren't subject to what's going on in Putin's Russia, in Trump's America. We can look at what's happening in Hungary. We can look at what's happening in multiple countries that have dealt with rising forms of authoritarianism and say, what are the other visions? So regulation is going to happen, but it's going to have to happen in different ways. And let me say this, Alistair, sometimes it's not always about regulation. I think sometimes it's really easy to just say, well, let the politicians take care of it. They're going to solve this for us. I don't think they are in this instance. I think this is going to have to be a collective question where we start to say, how do we organize? How do we represent? And we've got some great examples here. The first AI strikes, of course, have already happened in the United States, in Hollywood. We saw writers, we saw actors literally go on strike for many months, challenging their inability to pay their rent and feed themselves because it was that important to collectively bargain. I think we're going to start to see more of this, and for us, the question is, how do we make this a collective issue that we're going to care enough about that we are going to take action?
Okay, we've run over time. We could have gone on, we could go on all afternoon, I'm sure, but there are other discussions this afternoon, and all I want to say is thank you for the conversation, but more importantly, thank you for the work. I genuinely feel, my view is, this work is the Guernica of our times. It is about the struggle of power and how people can have a voice in that. So thank you very much. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Alistair. Thanks, everybody.
Please join me in giving a large round of applause to Kate Crawford and Alistair Hudson. Thank you so much. What an amazing conversation.